Did you know why Elm Street was chosen as the street name in A Nightmare on Elm Street? Well, before he went into making movies, director Wes Craven was a professor at Clarkson College of Technology in New York. The main street running through that college is Elm Street. One of the other reasons Elm Street was chosen was because that was the name of the street President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on in 1963. Welcome to the first episode of Scream School. I'm Matt McFarlane, and I'll be teaching you everything you need to know about the original A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. And if you learned something new today, make sure you subscribe to join the Madhouse. A Nightmare on Elm Street is a part of what a lot of us call the big three horror franchises, with Friday the 13th and Halloween being the other two. Wes Craven's idea for the story was originally inspired by articles he read in the LA Times. The articles were about a group of refugees escaping genocide in Southeast Asia. Story has it some of the refugee men died in their sleep after disturbing nightmares, which is a condition called SADS, or Sudden Arrhythmic Death Syndrome. Wes Craven thought it was a horrifying story and definitely seemed like something out of a movie. The original Nightmare movie was written and directed by Wes Craven, who famously also directed the first 4 Scream movies until his passing in August of 2015 from a brain tumor. A Nightmare on Elm Street follows the story of child killer Freddy Krueger in Springwood, Ohio. After being released from prison on a technicality, Freddy Krueger was then burned alive by the parents affected by his murders. But now, Fred murders people through their dreams as revenge for his victims' parents burning him alive. Did you know that a lot of the inspiration for the Freddy Krueger character came from Wes Craven's childhood? Well, specifically an elderly drunk homeless man wearing a fedora that creeped him out as a kid. One night as a kid, Wes Craven heard something out his window and spotted an older man lurking in the shadows. The man somehow sensed he was being watched and looked up at him. Wes hid, but when he came back to see if the man was still there, he was, and the man made a scary face to try and spook the kid, which was a terrifying moment Wes never forgot. This moment helped conceive the concept around Freddy, which is the thought of what personifies Wes Craven's vision as the worst kind of an adult and a kid's biggest fear, a dirty, old, evil, and twisted man who wants to scare and kill children at their most vulnerable moment, when they're asleep.
You know, in my mind, the killer of children is about the most despicable thing you can think, and the deepest and most profound betrayal of the innocence of a child.
A big goal in the production of A Nightmare on Elm Street was also to play into this underlying theme of a teenager's fear of not having any control. In the movie, you'll notice the kids can only really trust people their own age because the adults just constantly tell them they're crazy and they need to just get some sleep, which of course is the most dangerous thing they can do, further reminding the kids that they can't trust anyone but each other. Did you know that Freddy Krueger wasn't originally just a child killer? Initially, a part of Freddy's backstory was that he was a child molester, but Wes Craven eventually changed that to being a child murderer to avoid being accused of exploiting some highly publicized child molestation cases that occurred in California around the time of the film's production.
While we were filming the original film, there was this huge national news story.
The McMartin trial was going on endlessly. A school for children where the children had accused teachers of on a very systematic way.
We had to soft pedal the sexuality a little bit, but that was probably even better because it becomes subtext.
So how did Wes Craven come up with the name Freddy Krueger? Well, when Wes Craven was a young kid, he was bullied and beaten up at school by a kid named Fred Krueger. So take that, you little shit. You now share the same name as a famous child murderer. To further emphasize the attention to detail in creating Freddy's character, even the colors of Krueger's sweater, red and green, were taken from an article in a 1982 Scientific American magazine. In the article, Wes Craven read that these two colors were the most clashing colors to the human retina. So even just looking at Freddy creates an uncomfortable natural response. Craven also thought that having the killer carry a knife was too overdone, so instead he told special effects artist Jim Doyle to toy with the idea of gloves with steak knives, something that looked like it was made in the garage of a creepy man's house in a bad neighborhood. They even considered a sickle for Freddy's weapon of choice, but ultimately landed on the iconic glove after the 4th draft of the script.
The claw extends Freddy. It extends his evil. It extends his anger.
Freddie made it in the basement, so the glove had to actually be kind of crude.
It almost looks like a junior high school shop project from hell.
Freddy's signature posture of one shoulder slumped to one side like a gunslinger actually originally happened on accident. The glove was so heavy that it made Robert Englund's shoulders slump to a certain side, but after seeing how it looked, they loved it and Freddy's iconic posture was born. But funny enough, the first person to wear Freddy's glove in the movie wasn't Robert Englund. It was actually set carpenter Charles Belladonnari, whose special effects skills made him the one and only person who could cut the glove and insert the blades properly for that opening scene. Another thing that Wes Craven wanted to be unique about Freddy was that he wanted Freddy to be able to taunt and threaten his victims. So instead of a mask, he went with the burned and scarred face so Freddy could show more personality than some of the other killers in the genre. Now, we can't talk about Freddy Krueger without talking more about the man behind the burns. The role of Freddy Krueger is played by Robert Englund. Typically, in roles like this, a stuntman is usually casted, but Wes Craven really wanted someone with more acting ability. Robert Englund, a trained theater actor, was fresh off his first piece of acting success as a resistance fighter named Willie in a two-part miniseries called V, which was a sci-fi TV miniseries in the United States. Did you know that originally when everyone first met Robert Englund though, they thought he was a little bit too geeky and too happy-go-lucky for the role? Well, that all changed when Robert Englund really auditioned for the role. When he did, he darkened his lower eyelids using cigarette ash from his friend's car on the way to the audition. He also slicked his hair back to fit the profile of what he thought a weaselly child killer would look like.
He just relished being evil, and it brought out that wonderful thing about Freddy of it's the guy on the sidewalk frightening the kid, but he also was able to do it in almost a funny way.
However, originally the role of Freddy Krueger was supposed to be played by David Warner, who you might recognize from movies like Titanic or Scream 2, but Warner had to abandon the gig because of scheduling conflicts. Did you know that Freddy was also almost played by Kane Hodder? You probably recognize Kane's name because he played Jason Voorhees in 4 of the Friday the 13th movies, but Kane was in the running before Wes really even knew what type of person he wanted Freddy to be played by. Wes Craven, though, thought most of the people he auditioned for the role were too compassionate towards kids. One of the reasons Robert Englund got the role was because he was willing to go to those dark places in his mind. Kane, though, still got to play Freddy for a moment as the hand that grabs Jason's mask at the end of Jason Goes to Hell. One thing unique about Freddy, especially when compared to Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, is that Freddy not only has a plan and a method behind his killings, but Freddy also has a lot of personality, which is a big reason why he has such a loyal fan base even all these years later. Now, who is the brilliant effects person behind Freddy's makeup? Well, David Miller is his name. David was fresh off of working on one of the most iconic music videos of all time, Michael Jackson's Thriller from 1983. But I bet some of you didn't know that the final design of Freddy's look was based on pepperoni pizza.
I was at a restaurant one night and I was having pizza and I was just kind of deep in thought. I started playing around with the cheese, putting it around the pepperoni, and I actually made Freddy's face on the pizza.
Robert Englund also didn't wear the typical mask in the original Nightmare. He would undergo 3 hours of makeup before every shoot. The production would laugh that immediately after filming was over that day, they would see Robert ripping it off piece by piece the second he started walking away from the set. People would even follow behind him looking like giddy little kids picking up little pieces of the makeup. Now, we can't forget about the iconic Nightmare on Elm Street score, which was created by Charles Bernstein.
So the melody is playing with your sense of order. Maybe we go to there, and another note that doesn't belong. That theme really created the flavor for the film.
But the nursery rhyme was actually written by Wes Craven. Then the music part was created by Heather Langenkamp's boyfriend at the time, who was a musician. The original Nightmare on Elm Street, though, almost didn't even get made. The script was actually passed around Hollywood for 3 years with zero interest. Wes Craven even pitched the idea to Friday the 13th director Sean Cunningham, who basically told Wes, "I'm sorry, but this movie's not going to scare anyone because everything happens in a dream." Ultimately, even after the movie was passed up by every studio in Hollywood, a man by the name of Robert Shaye was the only person interested.
Nightmare on Elm Street came to Bob Shaye. He read it and liked it very much. He immediately knew there was a premise there that was strong and original.
And I thought it was incredibly inspired because it had this great marketing hook that was a familiarity to the entire world because we've all had nightmares. Everybody sleeps.
Bob is many different things, but he has an extraordinary intelligence, and he was able to see how that could grab an audience.
Bob Shaye was originally a copyright lawyer, and his niche early on in the industry was acquiring movie rights after they expired. The focus of his business at that time was to then show the acquired movies in 3 places: prisons, army bases, and colleges. If you think Bob Shaye's name sounds familiar, well, it's probably because he was the founder and CEO of a tiny little studio at the time in Lower Manhattan called New Line Cinema. And holy shit, was acquiring a Nightmare on Elm Street a good idea, because it ended up being a massive success, culturally, critically, and at the box office. At the box office, the first A Nightmare on Elm Street movie brought in $57 million on a $1 million budget, and today is considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made. This franchise is also what many say saved New Line from bankruptcy, which is why sometimes you hear that New Line is the house that Freddy built.
The film could have literally destroyed the company. And so there was a lot of tension around that during the release of the film.
When the film opened, to see this huge line around the block on Broadway of people waiting to get into the theater, then I knew that the fuse had been lit.
But things weren't always easy on set. The production has said it was obvious how much tension and pressure there was between Wes Craven and Bob Shaye. The reason was because both had a lot on the line at the time. Bob Shaye had essentially mortgaged his house, his company, and his entire life to gamble on making this movie. On the other hand, Wes Craven signed over the rights to the characters and everything to make this movie happen. But did you know which scene ended up being Wes Craven's call for a peace between the two of them? Well, it ended up being the melting stairs scene, which was an idea Bob came up with, inspired by nightmares that he had as a kid. Wes let Bob direct this scene as a way to call a truce between the two and remind Bob that they were on the same team. This now iconic scene was created by cutting out the carpet and filling it with Bisquick pancake mix. The mix sat long enough that it thickened into a very sticky paste. The original Nightmare began filming in Los Angeles in June of 1984 and lasted 32 days. Oh, and little fun fact, all of the high school scenes in the movie were filmed at John Marshall High School in LA, which is the same location for the movies Grease and Pretty in Pink. Now, I've already told you several reasons why A Nightmare on Elm Street is unique in the genre, but what's also unique about the first Nightmare movie is its cast of characters. Glenn Lance, who's dating Nancy Thompson in the movie, is played by Johnny Depp. This was Johnny Depp's film debut, and what's interesting is a big reason why Johnny Depp made it deep into auditioning without much experience was because Wes Craven's daughter thought his headshot was sexy, and he was a dreamboat, she said.
My daughter said, "Dad, Johnny Depp." I said, "Really? But he looks kind of sickly and pale." She says, "He's beautiful." And that was it.
Johnny Depp, though, really struggled on the set sometimes because he was so nervous and wanted to play Glenn so well. That could have been because he was casted to play kind of this all-American jock-type character, which I guess could have been a little bit outside his comfort zone. Wes Craven said in basically every scene he was in a cold, clammy sweat, and the others on set could see his hands shaking before his takes.
He was really pushing himself, into an area that was totally different, and I don't think something that he felt prepared for at all.
But did you know the role of Glenn almost went to another 80s heartthrob? Charlie Sheen almost played the role of Glenn, but because his agent demanded twice the weekly budget of $1,100, that was part of the reason Johnny Depp was casted instead. Now, obviously one of the biggest reasons for the first Nightmare's success was because of its final girl, Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp.
I really feel that she's a totally different kind of heroine, and that I don't think she is interchangeable like a lot of the girls in slasher movies.
Heather was interesting to me because she embodied sort of what I was looking for, which was a legitimate girl next door.
A survivor girl, one of the leading classic ingredients of contemporary horror. Heather probably being the leading example.
For the role of Nancy, Wes Craven said he wanted someone very non-Hollywood for the role, and Heather Langenkamp beat out over 200 other actors for this part. Even Robert Englund admits that Freddy considered Nancy one of his only worthy adversaries. An example of this is when Nancy has come to the realization that Freddy gets his powers from his victim's fears. Towards the end of the movie, you'll notice this as she calmly turns away to leave the room, and even though Freddy lunges at her, he evaporates.
What the ending of the original Nightmare on Elm Street means symbolically with Nancy turning her back on Freddy is, I won't participate in fear, the fear that Freddy engenders.
It's a very simple solution to all this mayhem.
Nancy realizes that that's how you stop it, is not to surrender to it.
What's also important in Nancy's story is the dynamic with her life at home. Because her parents' relationship isn't doing so well and her mom's clearly an alcoholic, you can tell she's had to grow up earlier than a lot of her classmates. This backstory molds a character the audience can sympathize with and root for. Did you know that Nancy's dad was probably the most famous actor on the set? Nancy's father, Don, is played by John Saxon, who you might also recognize from Black Christmas, one of the most important slasher movies of all time.
He's worked with everybody. I mean, John Saxon is the man.
You know, you realize this guy's a legend, and he can act, and he's awesome.
Nick Corey, who played Rod Lane in the movie, has an interesting backstory as well. Nick's real name is actually Sue Garcia. In the movie, he was pretending to be Italian because during this time in Hollywood, it was very rare for a Latin actor to get casted, especially in a feature film like this.
We weren't really typecast, but our essence of who we are really was displayed in those characters, and I think that's why all of us were very successful in portraying that group of teenagers.
Another reason why the first Nightmare is so iconic is not only how horrifying the idea of dying in your sleep is, but the deaths in the first movie and how they were pulled off by the production. And we have to start off by talking about Tina's death, which was filmed using a rotating set, which was slowly spun to allow Tina to roll into position. The camera was bolted to the wall and the cameraman strapped into an airplane chair beside it, which turned in tandem with the room. What's also interesting about Tina's death is she's made to be a red herring in the movie. We're led to believe this might be our final girl, similar to the movie Psycho, but also similar to what Wes Craven did many years later with Drew Barrymore in Scream. He kills Tina off early in the movie to shock the audience.
I did find the character Tina, when I read it, there was something intrinsically sad about her because she was sort of a victim of this broken home and she's left to really raise herself. Tina's experience was, I want to feel good and sort of escape this life that I have.
Actress Amanda Weiss, who played Tina, has also said she had a bit of a breakdown while filming this scene because of how disorientating the rotating set was. After some of the takes, she couldn't get rid of that feeling that she was constantly falling, and even yelled at the crew to get her out of there. But after reassurance from the cool, calm, and collected Wes Craven, the shooting continued and it turned out to be one of the most iconic scenes in the movie. Now, we have to talk about Glenn's famous death next, but first, how could it be a Wes Craven movie without an iconic phone call?
Hello? I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
That shocked people so much. It was one of the most startling moments of the first film when the special effects cost $5.
Heather wanted to eventually take that thing home, and we thought it was a little strange.
Did you know that Glenn's death was partially inspired by the blood scene in The Shining? To execute this scene, they used the same rotating set that was used for Tina's death. This was one of those scenes that had to be done in one take and they had to get it right the first time. The room was then set up to be upside down with the camera aligned to look right side up. The blood effect was created by pumping gallons of water mixed with red food coloring and poster paint down through the bed. The room was supposed to be turned so the blood would gush out then onto the walls, but because of the weight of the blood water, the room started to turn out of control, which made it pour out of the room and onto some of the wiring, equipment, and electrical sockets, even making the power go out for a little bit on set. The next scene I want to talk about no one dies but is just as iconic as any of them, which is the bathtub scene, which was shot using a bottomless tub which was built over a swimming pool. The underwater sequence was performed by her stunt woman Christina Johnson, but regardless, to film her part, Heather Langenkamp had to spend about 12 hours in the bath to film this scene. And to wrap up this episode, we need to talk about the ending to the movie. Did you know there was a massive disagreement in the production and how the movie should end? Yep, there was. Several different endings were shot and Wes Craven was adamant that the movie should have a happy ending because he had no intention for a sequel. Wes didn't think a sequel was really going to be possible. Bob Shea, though, as you might remember from earlier in this episode, is the founder of New Line. Bob thought a twist at the end was the better route and would leave open a hook for a potential sequel.
I've been accused of fighting for a movie that could have sequels, but that wasn't really the case. I just felt that the ending to the movie didn't send the audience out with any great excitement.
And he and I had lots of arguments. I said, okay, fine, I'll put him in a car, and we'll have the car have Freddy's stripes.
But it was always Wes's idea to pan to the little girls jumping rope, which is such an evocative ending. That's the real ending, and it's brilliant.
But the ending to A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984 does leave open a question that I can't answer. What was a dream and what was reality? The success of the first A Nightmare on Elm Street movie not only put New Line and Wes Craven officially on the map in Hollywood, but also spawned 8 more movies. The second, very different movie from the original, coming out less than a year later. Thanks for watching this episode. If you learned something new or had a good time watching the video, make sure to subscribe to join the Madhouse. But I'm Matt McFarlane, and join me in the next episode to learn something new about the horror genre.